It's been a fiasco. The highest death toll in Europe, over 44,000 people dead, and almost half of them in care homes. Policy U-turns, and not to mention the Dominic Cummings affair. By any measurement, this government seems to have done a pretty bad job of dealing with the pandemic, but could anyone do better? And will Boris, the Teflon politician that he is, be able to bounce back from it all? Hello everyone and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Today we've got two leading journalists to debate all of this. They're Stephen Castle, the London correspondent for the New York Times. Hello Stephen, where are you?
I'm in London. I'm in southeast London.
Very good, thank you. And we've got Christopher Montgomery, the co-editor of The Critic and formerly a strategist for the Vote Leave campaign in 2016. Where are you, Christopher?
I think worse than that. I was a director of Vote Leave and a strategist for the European Research Group. I'm in relatively sunny North Norfolk at the moment. Fantastic.
And you've just put the magazine, The Critic, to bed, I gather.
We have. So that's hitting the streets at the end of August.
Fantastic.
110 pages of chunky, upstream goodness.
Very good. It's a magazine we advertise in as well, and it is worth buying, worth reading. Anyway, you know the drill, everyone. Please put your questions in the Q&A box below here, and we'll open up the microphones in about 20 minutes after our initial discussion. Let's start with you, Stephen. For those who aren't based in the UK, just how bad have things been? What has the government got wrong? Stephen.
I mean, it's been pretty bad. I think, it's hard sometimes to remember that it's around about 9 months since Boris Johnson won one of the biggest election victories in recent times, with a larger majority than any prime minister for more than 2 decades. I mean, of course, at that point, nobody would have expected a global pandemic. And as you mentioned, Britain's had one of the highest death tolls in Europe. It's taken one of the biggest economic hits in Europe. I mean, was all of that Boris Johnson's fault? No, of course it wasn't. But I think there is, as events have moved forward, a sort of growing consensus that the government was rather slow to lock down in COVID. It did a poor job of protecting people, particularly in care homes. It's really struggled with some of the basic functions, like setting up a testing system, a tracking and tracing system. We were promised an app, several months ago. That hasn't materialized. And on top of that, there've been a whole series of sort of policy U-turns on everything from quarantine for people coming to the country to the most recent one about the grading of exams that were which did not take place this summer, but which determine university entrance, the A-level exams. So, I mean, in some respects, it's sort of slightly surprising that the Conservative Party's ratings aren't lower than they are. But I think the problem for the government at the moment is that increasingly people are starting to question its basic competence. Has it got a grip on the essential things? And I think that is really quite a dangerous thing for a government.
Christopher, I mean, one could forgive perhaps the government, or most governments across Europe have had a really torrid time dealing with the pandemic. And so perhaps for the sake of fairness, perhaps we should assess the government by its own standards. It did, as Stephen said, get an enormous majority. It had huge ambitions. It wanted to get Brexit done, which it's arguably on the way to doing, but also wanted to transform the state with some very big ambitions to sort of change the way politics have been done in the UK. So those were some sort of fairly high sort of ambitions that were set out during the election. How would you assess its performance if you're going to look at that?
It's destroyed the scope of the ambition they set out for themselves in whatever manifestos they had, and the means by which they were going to pursue them. Every time I travel back into London from Norfolk, I send despairing photographs to friends of, here is the Victoria Line platform at King's Cross, a mainline station in London, rush hour. I did it last Tuesday. There were 6 other people on the platform. This is a platform you normally would have to shoulder your way past screaming infants and pensioners to make to safety. If we go back to the start of this crisis, the thing that ministers said to me was, if we're in the pack, we're going to be okay. So the cynical calculation that politicians always make is, politics is always conducted in the future. What's going to happen to us in the future? We're already sitting here in our nice, comfortable ministerial office. The thing that we're interested in is, are we going to go on sitting in this nice, comfortable ministerial office? And their reckoning was that if the UK was part of a pack and wasn't an outlier, they wouldn't, in their own words at the time, be crucified by the voters, because the public would be fair. This was a once-in-a-generation pandemic since the Spanish flu, so that was the metric they expected to be judged on. If you look at the figures, the UK does seem to have done markedly worse than peer competitors in the way that we've responded to the crisis, though, and I'm not here to carry water for the government, though there might be a myriad number of reasons other than government policy or lack of government policies why that has happened. Yet, the really interesting thing to pick up on Stephen's point is that they haven't been crucified for this. Even the most recent opinion poll that came out in the Times, I think, this morning, there's a slightly ridiculous headline in the Times which says, Tories slump to 2% lead, which, you know, that wasn't where ministers were expecting to be at the beginning of this as they watched smartphone video footage from the Italian healthcare system collapsing live on air. They thought they were going to be in a much, much worse place. And if you look at France, always a ready comparator for Britain, Macron has been absolutely destroyed by what seems to be the French verdict on how France is doing, yet France has done intrinsically better than we have done by any reasonable scale of metrics. So there's a puzzling lack of punishment being doled out by the public. I don't want to blow the magazine's trumpet. We wrote a slightly despairing editorial at the beginning of all of this, saying that we feared the public were going to enjoy this pandemic too much, that there would be too much scolding and informing and performative telling off of people for not pulling together. So we were early bandwagon skeptics for sneering and snarking at clapping for our beloved NHS and all of that sort of thing. It does seem at the moment as if the government's getting away with its handling of the crisis, if you think the government has mishandled the crisis. And the only reason I'm caveating that way, if you think it's mishandled the crisis, is I'm simply not scientifically well informed enough to know whether something we did made things worse or whether we were always due, because of population and demography, to have a worse crisis than comparable countries.
So there are some people who suggest that we shouldn't have made this huge fuss over the NHS. And listen, the pandemic is going to have a devastating effect, but we need to prioritize the economy. And really, we should have been like Sweden and essentially let it rip. Why do you think that wasn't an option for the government?
I think because of the way the government panicked at the beginning. There was a clear sense of panic when that footage started appearing on the telly about, oh, here are very picturesque Italians dying in appalling circumstances in hospitals in Italy. If that's happening in another first world, then fellow EU member country, surely the same thing's going to happen here. And the other thing you can add to this about our beloved NHS is, given the innate skepticism so many Tory ministers have about the NHS, it's no wonder they must have thought at the time, indeed some of them said this to me, my God, the NHS is not going to be able to cope with anything like that. Yet, the other side of the equation is, because the NHS is always vastly more popular than anything else, if you think you've got an express train of very bad political news rushing down the tracks towards you, what's the thing that you're going to want to shelter behind? So I think it's no accident that, as it calls itself, the Vote Leave government wrapped itself in NHS branding, first and foremost. So people like me who are so unpleasant, we're coming to the right of this government, would say, you know, why protect the NHS? Surely the whole point of the wretched thing is that it's there to protect us. Misunderstood the communication strategy of the government, which was, if they're centering all government communications policies on defending the NHS, well, that's the patriotic rallying cry. So in other words, they're not putting themselves front and foremost, they're putting the beloved NHS front and foremost. And whether or not the NHS does a good job, manifestly the NHS does not do a good job, they're still able to hide behind the political clout of the NHS. So it was a perfectly sensible communication strategy. You cannot fault this government on its ability to get messages across. You can, of course, fault this government on its ability to do things in office.
Let's just pick up that last point on actually doing things in office. Stephen, do you know what the government is doing? I mean, where is the government heading? What is its current strategy? Can you sort of sum it up?
Its current strategy, I think, is sort of a day-by-day phenomenon. I mean, at the moment we're embroiled in this huge crisis over exam results, which actually I think could be potentially rather damaging for the government, because, you know, it is something that touches the lives of a lot of people, you know, and not just the students who are involved, but their parents, their grandparents, their relatives, their friends, and whatever. So at the moment, there's a big push to dig the government's way out of this. And of course, the next problem coming down the track is getting schools back in September. Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, his job is really, I think, on the line. If he fails to deliver that, he's going to be in big trouble. But I think the broader thought of the government that what it really needs to do now, I think there's a general sort of acknowledgement that the public thinks that the early stages of the pandemic have not been handled well. But I think the hope in the government is that if it can avoid a very serious second wave, and if it can manage the economic recovery better than expected, and perhaps better than some other European countries, then maybe by the time we get to the next election, which, let's face it, is, you know, not for another 4 years, all this will have been forgotten. So I think the government strategy, in as much as there is one, you know, will pursue its themes of levelling up if it can, and all those are going to be much harder. But its strategy is going to be, right, that was a problem we had in 2020, but by 2024 we'll be in a different place.
Christopher, we were talking about the criticism made by Johnson and his colleagues of both Cameron and the May administrations about sort of government by press conference and the sort of failure to actually create policies that were long lasting. But as you were just saying now, they just seem to be doing exactly the same thing. Why is this? Why don't they seem to have I mean, we understand that the pandemic is very hard to, you know, for any government, as just say, to handle. But can we talk a bit about the leadership? Can we talk about Boris? We can talk about how policy is created in Downing Street. What's going on? Why is it so sclerotic?
You had two critiques simultaneously. You had the Cummings critique of a machine at the centre. So he was very harsh on Cameron and Ed Llewellyn as being people who were always, they were jesters. They were responsive to the jeers and catcalls of an audience that Cummings felt they shouldn't be paying any attention to. You have Boris as a supreme cynic and a former hack himself, and therefore having a healthy disregard for the froth of headlines and leader columns. So in theory, it seemed as if 5-6 months ago, these things were fusing, and there was a profound skepticism about the power of the press. And even though I'm in the press, I, as a fairly right-wing Tory, am sympathetic to that as a critique. But as you say, it doesn't seem to be what's borne out in practice. Let's pick up on a point that Stephen made about the state of Gavin Williamson's career. 6-7 weeks ago, when the main lockdown restrictions were lifted, the government was convinced that what we're going to do is we're going to get people to go back to work. So they made a publicity drive to get people to start working again, because so many urban areas in Britain rely upon the footfall of people actually travelling to work, being in their office, working from whichever urban context they choose to work from. I'll give you an example of how this has failed. The magazine's offices in Westminster, whenever I go into Westminster, I see cafes which 4 or 5 weeks ago reopened in a blaze of optimism. Half of them have boarded themselves up again. Now, Westminster is a government district, which means it's slightly unrepresentative of London business districts. But that means that civil servants who are line managed by ministers were not brought to work back at their desks. The Cabinet Office is the British government department headed by Michael Gove, which coordinates the British response to the pandemic. I think the Mail showed earlier in the week with FOI requests that roughly 10% of Cabinet Office civil servants had started working from their desks again.
Yeah.
So it's been a disaster in terms of the government showing practical workplace-based leadership and getting people to start working from their workplaces again. So they jumped this as the approach, and they've now put all of their eggs in one basket, which is that people are going to go back to school. So I'm a parent. My child has not been at school for 5.5 months.
I'm going to jump in there. What I want to do is possibly move on. The crisis management of the pandemic is dominating, but I guess my question is there any room for any other policy? We can see Brexit negotiations are clearly taking place, and we expect there could be a deal by the end of the year. So that would be a major tick. You know, they're getting Brexit done. The other main policy or policy drive was this huge shift into labour areas and basically saying we're going to look after you. These working class areas, former labour areas, are going to be transformed. Earlier this summer, Boris talked about a new deal, which was meant in a way to partly address that. I'm trying to see if there is any vision here. Are we getting a sense that there are other policies that are being implemented beyond the panic over what's happening in terms of, you know, the pandemic? Christopher?
I'm very cynical about this. If you're living in one of these former Labour seats in the Midlands that has just returned on a small majority of Tory MP, the proposition is that you can come up with policies in SW1 which will somehow transfigure the attitude of voters in those seats to the political economy of this country. How would you do that in practice? So one suggestion is, oh, let's move a government agency to Walsall. Well, other than the handful of jobs that will come with that government agency, because they're never that vast, moving to Walsall, why will this transform the attitude of voters to everything else that's going on in their lives? And it seems an extraordinary mistake for what keeps calling itself the Vote Leave government to make. Ultimately, Brexit won the referendum because people who didn't feel they had a stake in the future of this country and, you know, looked at objectively their circumstances bore that out. They didn't have a stake in the future of the country, were motivated to vote. It was a negative vote. It was a vote against the world that EU membership meant for them, which was their lives were not exactly perfect. Why does anyone think that moving 120 civil servants to 100 miles from where they're currently based is going to change the way their lives are going to work? It just strikes me as being so much guff.
Now, I didn't expect you to agree with each other so much, so I'm slightly disappointed. But essentially what you seem to be saying, Christopher, is that this government is ideologically hollow. Stephen, just to follow up on that, just to follow up on what Christopher was saying, Brexit was a revolution. It was it wasn't so much a proposal of clear, concrete ideas. It was trying to get away with what we were beforehand, and it doesn't necessarily map out a clear way forward. So we're lost. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I'm not sure we're completely lost, but I think it has proved to be it's been the nightmare for Theresa May. I mean, it completely paralysed the government of Theresa May. For Boris Johnson, it has been a pathway to power.
Yeah, but if Brexit is the sort of thing that glues them together, you know, once you've got it beyond that, where do you go?
Well, I mean, I suspect that what we're going to see is a trade deal, because I think the imperative now on the government is much greater to get a trade deal. It's sort of was one of the legacies of the handling of the pandemic, is that the government's reputation for competence is now on the line. And therefore, I think if there is, as there inevitably will be, disruption on January the 2nd after Britain leaves the single market and the customs union, it gets harder for the government to just blame that on the EU if it hasn't managed to secure the deal that it said it would do. I also think that Boris Johnson, you know, like most prime ministers, he would prefer to have a deal than no deal. I mean, where that gets Britain for the next few years, I think it makes things harder, because I think there will be an economic hit, certainly in the short term, and that makes that agenda of levelling up to the forgotten parts of the country much more difficult, allied, of course, to a pandemic. You know, one would suspect that even if the polls have held up pretty well so far for the Tories, by this time next year, midterm, they will be significantly worse, particularly because, although Boris Johnson won this huge victory, let's not forget that that was against Jeremy Corbyn, a man who was regarded by much of the electorate as just far too left-wing and unelectable. And it's noticeable that we've seen his replacement, Keir Starmer, who is a not terribly charismatic politician, but essentially what he's doing is trying to say to the public, look, the government is incompetent and I'm competent, and that seems to be having a bit of traction at the moment.
Yeah, I would love to have everyone's questions, so please do start writing them in there. I'm going to quote Howard Gatiss, who's one of our, a keen traveller with political tours, and he says, "Nicholas, am I going to be enlightened or enraged? Howard, I'd like to know your answer now, please, if you care to join us and put give us your comments." There are problems around the corner. Next year, we've got the elections in Scotland and Holyrood, which are likely to give Nicola Sturgeon another push for independence. So that, and Christopher, how does Boris deal with that? How is Boris dealing with that?
At the moment, they're using optics to travel to Scotland. This is a subject. I used to run something called Friends of the Union, which you might expect as an Ulsterman obsesses me. They make these quasi-vice-regal visits to Scotland from London. They've decided to roll out new branding. So money that was spent from EU funds in Scotland will now be funded from London directly and will be badged with the Union Jack on it. So they're making a lot of noise about ways that they're going to address the challenge from the SNP. The thing that they're promising at the moment they're going to do is respect the 2014 referendum, which the SNP itself said would be a once-in-a-generation choice. And the drift of Tory thinking is, even if the SNP didn't mean it, we should mean it. You can, if you stretch these things out into the near future, see a sort of Catalonia situation happening where an already very badly split SNP between the Sturgeon and Alex Salmond factions is confronted with having to engage in a lawless referendum, but that does depend upon Westminster and Whitehall holding its nerve. I can't see any circumstances in which a Tory government in London could see any mileage for itself in conceding a second independence referendum so soon after the first one. There are some people who whisper behind the scenes, well, it worked for Canada. The second Quebec referendum killed off separatism, stone cold dead. I don't think that's a relevant comparison to the situation in Scotland.
So you actually think that the government in Westminster can just continue to sort of ignore it and just say, no, you can't have one?
I think that if you remember the way that the Indie Ref was covered in the national press here, people confidently talked about David Cameron clinging on if the vote in Scotland was lost. As David Cameron himself rakishly admitted years afterwards, well, of course I'd have had to resign if Scotland left the Union on my watch as Prime Minister. There was no way I was staying in. Well, just as that was true of David Cameron, it's true of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson stops being Prime Minister the moment Scotland votes itself out of the Union. So why does he give a vote on the Union that he doesn't need to give? That seems to me a fairly simple political calculation for Boris to make.
Stephen, what do you think?
I mean, I suspect that's right. In the short term anyway, Boris Johnson will probably just say no. I think the danger for the Union is that this will sort of feed the sense of resentment in Scotland. And the idea, I mean, this again, slightly depends on the outcome of Brexit and whether it is damaging or significantly damaging or not. But I mean, I think if you look at the legacy of the Thatcher years, from that time onward, when Scotland essentially voted time after time for a Labour government, got a Conservative government, that sort of trend is slightly repeating here, because we're seeing, you know, the SNP in Holyrood, we're seeing Scotland vote against Brexit, it gets Brexit. And I think there's just a danger that politics in Scotland diverges from politics in the rest of the UK, and you notice that when you go there, that the political debate is just strikingly different, and that ultimately that will result probably not under this Prime Minister in a second referendum, and that could be closer than the last one. Of course, there was a Brexit is a kind of interesting question, because I think it will make the economic case for Scottish independence much harder. But again, feeding into that sense of resentment and this divergence between Scotland and England, it probably makes the political case easier. Who wants in Scotland to be their voice to be ignored? That will be the argument, and therefore it could be a much closer result next time.
Stephen, you work for the New York Times, so you're covering stories and trying to interpret them for a very different audience, different readership. Do you get a sense of how people in Washington or New York view what's going on in the UK?
I think, actually we were a little bit sort of surprised, because we thought, Brexit obviously was a huge story, and it was a huge story globally. Actually, in terms of the international readership, it was Brexit and the UK last year was the biggest story in terms of interest from readers on digital readers, of whom we have a lot. So that was, we kind of knew that. We were thinking this year that perhaps with the pandemic, as Christopher suggested, if Britain had been sort of performed better than Italy and better than the US, actually Britain wouldn't be such a big story, given that the Brexit negotiations were becoming a little bit technical and trade related. However, the thing about Boris Johnson is that he's a newsmaker. He's a sort of figure on the international stage. He just can't stop making news. And, stories from Britain are of significant interest, because here is a character who is entertaining, interesting. His life is incredibly dramatic. When you consider what has happened to Boris Johnson in the last year or so, he was sort of down and out, then became Prime Minister, he's getting divorced, he's becoming a father, he contracts COVID, he nearly dies, he comes back. This is an extraordinary character. And I think a lot of that sustains interest, as well as just the familiarity and interest in Britain. So there's a bit of puzzlement in the US about various decisions, particularly Brexit. A lot of curiosity about our institutions. The Speaker of the House of Commons, all that was of great interest. But we've been pleasantly surprised to find out how interested American readers are in what's going on here.
Yeah, let's start bringing in some people to ask questions. So we've got Diane Cook coming, and then followed by Simon Jackson. While Diane is coming online, Christopher, I'm going to ask you one last question, which is why is Boris so able to avoid all this flack? How does he's a sort of Teflon Don? How does he manage it?
Comes in with built-in low expectations, but also built-in comic expectations. Boris has always, from school onwards, contrived to be indulged. How he has managed that is beyond a mere mortal like me, but everyone at every stage of his life has made the excuses for him that other politicians and people have to make for themselves. And it does get you out of a lot of jams if other people are already getting you out of those jams.
Yeah, and the government's been doing a very good job of blaming quangos for the moment as well. It's seems to be throwing quangos under the bus rather than ministers, but maybe ministers will follow very soon. Diane, your question, go ahead. Go on, Diane, you just need to unplug your mic. There you go, Diane. Go on, there you go.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes, it is, good. It's just when you were talking about Scotland and a second referendum and so on, my question is about the role of the current, or the impact of the current white paper on replacing EU rules with UK rules, which the devolved administrations are suggesting cut across their powers. So it seemed, the question I suppose is the fight going to be sooner rather than later on the United Kingdom?
So let's just to recap that. So you've got a whole series of regulations and areas that the EU had responsibility, in which sort of sovereignty was pooled within the EU. Now those powers being handed back to the United Kingdom, there's an argument over whether Westminster should be controlling those powers, or should some of those regulatory powers be devolved to Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Christopher, what's your view on this? You're for some reason your microphone doesn't pick up. Let's just maybe talk a bit louder.
Hello, is that any better? Right, sorry, I have a terrible tendency to mumble. It's the usual nationalist stroke hardline devolutionist ramp. So the powers that are coming back and are going to be solely exercised by UK central government were never within the competence of devolved bodies which didn't exist when we joined the EU in the first place. So it's a sort of bait and switch. They're saying because the EU single market is coming to an end, with Britain as a component part of that, we, for some reason in Holyrood, Cardiff and Stormont, should have a competence which we never had before and would make a nonsense of the economic unity of the UK. So it's a perfectly legitimate and sensible thing for nationalists to claim, but obviously if you don't agree with nationalism, it makes no economic sense whatsoever.
Stephen, can they sidestep this? Can Westminster retain most of these powers? What do you think? And what do you think of that white paper?
I think it probably can. I think it's part of the general, it'll feed into the nationalist, the SNP narrative. I think one of the more interesting things was I saw that there was some complaints from Wales, actually, about them, particularly from a Labour administration, which isn't separatist. I mean, so that's interesting. And I think it does add a bit of flavour to that.
Warned that it would undermine the union, didn't he? That was a statement which was made yesterday, that this white paper really undermines. If you go ahead and you retain these powers, or you take these powers from Brussels and keep them Westminster, that's going to undermine the union. And that was a Labour administration in Wales that is obviously in favour of the union, that is unionist.
Indeed. And I do think it sort of illustrates the tension at which the union is under. I mean, I'd be interested to know Christopher's views, but I mean, it's the first time in my lifetime that people seem to be discussing a united Ireland. I mean, that was unthinkable for most of the time I've been, and I'm not sure it's particularly likely, but you know, the fact that it's even on the agenda is pretty extraordinary. And I think that is going to be one of the themes for us going forward, looking particularly at Scotland, where, as I say, there's just there's a kind of divergence of the political system. If you have the main political parties that are represented at Westminster really, you know, in a minority in Scotland, I mean, you know, if you have so few MPs of Westminster, Scottish MPs from the Labour Party, from the Conservative Party, from the Liberal Democrats, then you're bound to have some form of tension. And so it'll be very interesting to see if the Scottish Conservatives can sort of do something to revive their fortunes, because if not, then you know, you really do have a huge divergence going on.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you for that question, Diane. Simon Jackson, this is a question for Christopher. Simon, go ahead.
I agree with Christopher that the EU referendum was, like Trump's election, a vote against the status quo rather than for any particular alternative. But in a post-pandemic world where the quality of our trade negotiators is such that they're prepared to grandstand over £100,000 worth of Stilton, which joint of the pig in the poke would he presently have us look forward to?
I'm slightly relieved that we haven't entered into World War III, which was one of the predictions the other side offered during the referendum. So I think we can always find a less gloomy side to look at things. To be completely cynical about the effect of the pandemic on the trade aspect of the Brexit negotiations, what's the worst that could happen at this stage? We choked off a quarter of all economic life in this country, and we're still here. So it'll be whatever the worst outcome of the trade talks would be if you had lingering Remain sympathies. It's difficult to see what could come out of the Brexit trade talks that would be so disastrous compared to what we've gone through. So again, it goes back to the point about Boris and all of his sins being priced in. If you're skeptical about Brexit, the worst things that you said could potentially happen as a result of Brexit have happened as a result of the pandemic by a factor of 100. So
Good line. Brexit, better than a pandemic.
Everything's done in terms of comparisons.
Right. It does. Okay. Simon, does that answer the question?
Let's just say that it hasn't exactly converted me.
No. Okay. I don't think you were meant to be converted anyway. Hilary Matthews. Hilary, let's bring up Hilary. I think I'm not too sure if we've got her there. Yeah, Hilary, go ahead. Go on.
Yes, I would just like to know whether what the press says about Dominic Cummings is really true. In other words, does he really wield the power that the press maintains he does? And if he does, how have we come to such a position that an unelected official wields so much power? It's unconscionable to me if it's true.
I would love to get both your thoughts, both Stephen and Christopher, on this. Christopher, can you reveal your hand slightly? Because you've worked alongside Dominic Cummings previously, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, I was director of Vote Leave. But advisors have no agency in our system. Advisors have no power. Anything that any advisor, and throughout the last 200 years, prime ministers have always had shadowy figures, or in Dom's case, less shadowy figures, but they only exist at the whim and convenience of the Prime Minister. Whatever Dominic Cummings is doing, it's because it serves the purposes of Boris Johnson. And you only have to look at Boris Johnson's career. When at The Spectator was run by a very genial man called Stuart Reid. When at City Hall, a succession of deputy mayors ran City Hall for him. At the Foreign Office, a man who despised Boris, called Alan Duncan, who was then Minister of State, ran the Foreign Office for him. It's not exactly a psychological surprise that Boris is very content to devolve the knife work of government to other people. It's also a very sensible political strategy. As and when things go wrong, and of course they're going to go wrong, Boris has a very long list of people he can throw under a bus to suit his own purposes. At some point, Cummings can be sacked. At some point, Michael Gove can be sacked. Anyone can be sacked as long as they preserve the principle. I think Boris has a very healthy and sound attitude towards how politics is conducted.
Now, my dog has chosen the opportunity to play with a ball or a bottle in the corridor behind me here, and Karen is just going to go and deal with them. So that's the noise in the background. Stephen, so it's legitimate for a government to sort of, Boris is, relied on advisors. It's previous governments have used independent advisors for a long time. It would seem that he's unusually dependent upon Dominic Cummings. Stephen?
I agree with that. And I think the surprising thing is that he was allowed to get away with what he did in terms of his trip to Durham, his trip to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight, and all manner of things that actually have undermined, significantly at that time, undermined sort of trust in the government's messaging. And the fact that Dominic Cummings survived that, it illustrates his importance to Boris Johnson. And I think one of the reasons for that is that Boris Johnson, he's been around a long time. We know a little bit about his politics. He's sort of libertarian. He's free market. He doesn't like the nanny state. But we don't really know we didn't know a lot about what he wanted to do in Downing Street. In fact, I think it was somebody in The Guardian wrote, that I think it was Marina Hyde wrote that, Boris Johnson, he always wanted to be Prime Minister. He always wanted to have been Prime Minister so he could go on the sort of lecture circuit. It was just the rather inconvenient time in between that he wasn't sure about. I mean, that's a little bit of a pastiche, obviously, but I do think that Dominic Cummings provides that sort of ideological heft, that direction to the government. He's the author of this levelling up agenda. He's driving a lot of stuff forward, and we do see, and I think this is one of the difficulties of government, this particular government, we do see a very centralising tendency in Downing Street, with it very reluctant to allow ministers to get on and take their own decisions. And we've seen, I think, with the exams fiasco, one of the consequences of that. You haven't got a heavyweight cabinet of really competent people, former ministers like Jeremy Hunt, former Foreign Secretary, former Health Minister. He's on the back benches and face didn't really fit, challenged Boris Johnson. So, you do see the limitations of that strategy, because ultimately a good government has good cabinet ministers, and this cabinet is rather weak.
Christopher, that's a fair point. I mean, good ministers are able to sort of question their own advisors' advice. They should have a good grip on their own departments and a good sort of strategic assessment of where they're going. And it just doesn't seem that as though this government's got that.
Ministers can have a grip on their own department, but what they can't have a grip on are things which have been given statutory independence. So a lot of this is the consequence of the Quango state. But again, this goes back to, is Cummings essentially talk? Ofqual came to decisions which Ofqual was entitled to take and was set up to take. Gavin Williamson, as Secretary of State, had no way of gainsaying that without dismissing Ofqual. If he had done that, and if the optics of this fiasco had still been bad, he would have been blamed precisely for having ignored the experts. It would have been self-indulgent Tory minister ignores education professionals and comes up with own gimcrack solutions out of private office. So there's a lose-lose thing that happens to politicians here. I'm more sympathetic to Gavin Williamson than most people, but I fear Gavin's fate at the moment is to be held in place to see whether children successfully get back to school and whether the unions allow schools to reopen in September. So I think it's essentially a stay of execution for him until we see whether everyone's back at school next month.
Okay, thank you both for that. Lynn Maddock, let's bring Lynn online. Lynn is an economist. Sometimes has problem with feedback. I don't know where that is, but go ahead, Lynn.
Hi, Nicholas. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go on.
I'm interested in the trade agreements, because I'd suggest that the UK needs one with the US, and I can't see one that will be negotiated by a weakish Britain that will do anything other than make Johnson even more unpopular because of the need to give away whatever it might be, agriculture, drugs, media, that sort of thing, to be able to negotiate an agreement with the US. Is that a fair assessment?
Stephen, how much of our trade is currently with the US, and how much potential does it have? And then come on to Lynn's question about whether there could be a deal.
It's a huge partner. It's a huge trade partner. But I think one of the sort of striking things that this year is I don't think that actually anybody has ever really thought that a US trade deal was going to be struck this year. I mean, it was noticeable if you talk to American diplomats, before the early months of this year, they were saying, why isn't the British government moving ahead? We can, Trump can do a great deal. And the reality is that a US trade deal delivers relatively little economically for the UK at quite considerable political cost. Things like hormone, beef, chlorinated chicken. I mean, maybe or maybe not, these are sort of threats to individuals. They're probably not health threats, but they're not very popular, and GMOs are not very popular. So there are a whole series of things that you have to encounter in order to get a trade deal, which ultimately actually delivers very little. I mean, I can remember in Theresa May's government when the Treasury did a projection of how much all the trade deals would be worth. That's sort of the US trade deal and Trans-Pacific Partnership had thrown in a lot of countries. By 2035, it was worth about 0.2% of GDP, which of course was a considerably, several times, almost 10 times, more than 10 times less than Britain would have lost in some scenarios from leaving the EU. And we've got a US presidential election coming up. There's no possibility of a trade deal this side of the election. We'll then have to see, who's in the White House after that. And my hunch is that the US trade thing will go pretty quiet. The benefits don't really outweigh significantly the political cost.
Christopher, what do you think?
Going to betray, amongst such fine journalistic comment, my background in politics and come up with a therefore shabby answer. Just as the EU wasn't popular or unpopular because of its trade policies, I don't think any future government will be popular or unpopular because of trade deals with the US or Australia or anywhere else. The truth is, it's all a wash mostly. I mean, they make so marginal a difference to the economic performance of countries. It's hard to see what the backwash into the political system will be if you contract the deal or don't contract the deal. So I don't see the trade deals as being the politically operative thing a lot of high-end comment thinks they are. It's the sort of thing that obsesses the more intellectual wing of the press because it's granular, it seems to speak to overarching systems. People can write about clever deals that are going to come out of this or that or the other, but it's always difficult to see how that presents itself as something that's going to motivate voters one way or the other. So I just come back to, we didn't vote against the EU because we felt the EU's trade policies were deficient or insufficiently successful. So don't think of future trade deals in other circumstances as having any more political clout than that did.
Okay, I'd love more questions, please, everyone. So just bring them if you can write in the Q&A. If those of you who have asked questions already and want to ask more, please, please go ahead, either raise your hand or write them down there. There was an article that came out in The Atlantic recently by Tom McTague. I don't know if you've seen that, Christopher.
Tom's a great guy.
Which suggests that that Boris is just a symptom of a broader malaise within the British government, that our ability to see crises, our ability to deal with crises, also the civil service, their ability to deal with problems has got weaker over time. And we're becoming the poor man of Europe. What do you get a sense of? Is that something you'd agree with? Do you believe in Boris's boosterism, or are we about to see a huge rebound of UK power and the economy? What's your view?
I sometimes wonder if Tom's been reading too much of the New York Times coverage of the UK. I'm not convinced by this idea that we are sinking into the sea in the way that we were in the 1970s. Things don't seem that bad here. Again, I make a boring political point rather than a journalistic one. If people come out with extravagant critiques, as the Remain side did during the referendum, oh, we are now a second world nation, or whatever the argument's going to amount to, it's going to discredit them before it achieves them any great political success. So I know it's dull, but I think this is where Keir Starmer was a very, very good politician. Stephen said he was uncharismatic. I think uncharismatic can be very, very profitable when you're up against somebody who's as extravagant as Boris. I think Labour is right to pursue the policy of a nuanced, calibrated critique of the government rather than saying all is lost, all is doom, all is black.
Okay, I do want to read a bit of Tom McTague's article to you. I mean, there are his supporters in Parliament who see he looks more like Silvio Berlusconi than Ronald Reagan. The Prime Minister indicated the kind of big thinking optimism that he believes is necessary with a recent speech detailing his plans to bring Britain out of its pandemic slump with a Rooseveltian deal. Yet what did it amount to? Little more than a mishmash of existing projects, a speech and a plan that seemed to confirm Johnson's own critique about the country's systemic failure to think big and act boldly. I mean, both of you have been saying the government can't implement policy. Is that fair, Christopher?
Yes, but I come at that from a slightly different standpoint, which is government shouldn't implement half of these policies. So warm words are a very good substitute for actions they shouldn't take. So I'm quite happy that they recycle press releases of spending that they've long ago already committed to. Thank God they're not actually doing the spending some people would have them do.
So minimal government. Let's bring Simon Jackson in, because you've got an additional comment here. Simon, go ahead.
I just think that, is Boris not proof of the increasing divergence between the skill sets necessary to win an election and those required to do the job afterwards. I mean, you see this isn't just limited to this country, but to my mind, this is something that is a fundamental danger to democracy, and one of the reasons that the younger generation is completely turned off the idea of voting.
Stephen, I mean, Christopher was just saying that, you know, Keir Starmer looks competent. You were saying the same thing. So that's and people clearly want some form of competence in the United States when they're voting for Joe Biden. So there seems to be a move away from populism. Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually the sense, if Biden wins in the US, which it looks like according to the polls he will, but you know, we've been there before, it'll probably actually be a mixture of competence and actually people saying, look, we just want this to stop. There's been too much craziness in the last 4 years. I mean, I think the point about winning elections and governing is a very good point, but I would just caution that even though Boris Johnson won this huge majority, he was running against the most left-wing leader of the Labour Party in my lifetime, probably more than Michael Foot. And a lot of the electorate was actually just motivated probably by wanting not what it didn't want to have. So I think in a sense, it'll be a much more interesting test if, when we get to 2024, we still have the two current party leaders. I mean, we'll probably have Keir Starmer, but if Boris Johnson, which he probably will, but you know, it's not certain, if he survives till 2024, next general election is likely to be, then we will have a better metric of whether those two factors, competence and ability to win elections, can match, because the circumstances, nobody knows the circumstances of those of that election. It seems unlikely now, if we had an election tomorrow, that Boris Johnson would win against Keir Starmer, even if the Tories are slightly edging it in the polls at the moment. But you know, who knows?
What would you like Boris to do with his stonking majority? What would you like? I mean, you've just suggested that you don't want him to do very much.
It's possible, yes. Which, just to pick up on the question from the audience, I'm not sympathetic to this critique of democracy that we're ending up with politicians who can campaign rather than politicians who can govern. If that's a problem, it's the fault of the public rather than the fault of politicians. We have free and open elections in this country. If the public don't like the politicians they're ending up with, well, the remedy is very much in their own hands. So that's why I come back to the point I made about Tom McTagg's excellent piece in The Atlantic. I think you can take the analysis of crisis in Britain much, much too far. We've had a genuine crisis this year, and it puts, I think, into relief the complaints that people were making in the previous decade. Things really weren't so bad, but if we had had this Zoominar 2 years ago, you would have had stories of Britain's falling to pieces, our constitutional order has been disrupted, Theresa May can't govern, we're going the way of insert failed foreign country here. And it was overdone then, and it's overdone now. What should Boris do? He should do some of the things in his manifesto. The critiques in the manifesto seem to make sense to me. I just don't see any convincing evidence there's going to be much delivery at the moment. So Boris talks a much better fight than Boris actually fights.
Just to, we've got another question from Stuart Williams, if we can bring Stuart in. And then I think there's Nigel Harley as well. Nigel, I can't see Stuart Williams at the moment. I hope you come. Yes, Stuart, go on, Stuart Williams. If you just unplug your microphone, and there you go, Stuart.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now, yeah.
Yes. The question is, who might replace Boris as leader of the Conservatives, and how do your panelists there rate the prospects for Rishi Sunak?
Let's start with Stephen, and then both quickly. Stephen and then Christopher. Stephen.
I mean, he's the cabinet minister who's had the best pandemic, if we can put it like that. Having said that, of course, he's done that by doling out billions and billions of pounds in spending. I mean, really an extraordinary sum of money. And the test will be whether, when that has to be reined back, he still retains the same sort of level of popularity that he does at the moment. And that seems to me unlikely. But I think his future is absolutely critical to the government. I mean, tension between prime ministers and chancellors is a sort of perennial thing, and I think there'll be an exception here. But I think the key for Boris Johnson now is if this government can manage the recovery better than people are expecting, because that really is their only real hope of recovering from what's happened in the last 6 months or so.
Christopher, go on, Christopher, go on.
I agree with Stephen. It's easy for Sunak to be popular outside Westminster when he's spending billions of taxpayers' money. My sense amongst Tory MPs is he's not that popular or respected with them, partially because he's very young, and Tory MPs are always thrown by that, even if they're young themselves. Also, the terms in which he accepted his job were the terms that his predecessor, Sajid Javid, refused to accept. So he's not seen as being an independent, freestanding man, apart from the number 10 machine. So it's actually difficult to see circumstances in which Boris falls and a replacement is needed in this parliament, that the current Chancellor would be able to escape whatever carnage was happening to create the vacancy in the first place.
Yeah, okay. Nigel Harley, let's bring Nigel in. Go ahead, Nigel. You there, Nigel? Just need to unplug your microphone again on the bottom left-hand side. So whilst Nigel's, if Nigel's going to join us, I'm not too sure. But whilst he's there, or whilst we're waiting for him, Christopher, I'm really interested in this point about the union. And for me, I think the biggest challenge to the government, or any UK government in the next 5 years, next decade, is going to be the state of the union. And I would suggest that Brexit is the sort of centrifugal force that's pushing us apart. But you don't think so?
Well, because the challenge from Scottish nationalism predates Brexit, long predates Brexit. It was the claim of people who supported devolution that it would kill nationalism stone cold dead. All it has done is put nationalists into office they were never able to exercise before. Stephen makes the entirely valid point that when you go to Scotland, you find yourself in a different political ecosystem. Well, you find yourself in a different political ecosystem because devolution has created one. So people like me who are always skeptical about devolution think, well, yes, it's working out exactly as badly as we thought. And you have to be right.
Accentuated it when you've got a you had a vote that clearly the vast majority of people in Scotland voted to remain within the EU, as people in Northern Ireland did too. And you have a government in Westminster that has imposed a solution upon them.
It was 60-40 something in Scotland and 55-45% in favour of Remain in Ulster, and there was a majority in Wales. It's difficult. You made the point earlier that actually Brexit, when it works itself out, will produce harder challenges for economic separation. So if you split up the UK in the context of the UK not being in the EU, it makes it much harder for nationalists to make vague claims about, well, we'll be an independent Scotland in the EU that the rest of the UK is already in. So there is a perfectly valid hard unionist argument for Brexit, but it does depend upon a fairly hard Brexit.
Don't take back control. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Nigel, thank you. Nigel,
you've absolutely answered my question. That was precisely what my question was going to be.
What was the question going to be?
Well, no, it was all about that because, obviously when the first referendum took place, this was prior to the Brexit vote. I mean, whatever one says, there is an immense democratic deficit. And I suppose my question is, if there was a second referendum, how much would that deficit play into it?
I think it's worth commentating. We've just got a couple of minutes there. So both of you give your views on that. Stephen, to start with.
Just to pick up Chris's point, I mean, he may be right, but I don't think there's any way back for devolution. I mean, I don't think we're going to get rid of the Scottish Parliament and all the devolved institutions. And I think the one of the lessons of Vote Leave was that people, But while it is certainly true that in Scotland, it's going to be harder economically to detach itself from the rest of the UK, people don't always make their decision based on the economic case. They didn't in 2016, where just about everybody agreed that Britain would probably be worse off economically. They decided on the basis of sovereignty. And I think there's a real risk that that happens in Scotland the next time around, because, you know, the stakes will be much higher. It'll be the second referendum. It will really, if it goes against independence, it really will kill off independence the way that, for the foreseeable future, in the way that happened in Canada.
Christopher, that's a really fair point, isn't it? And you seem to suggest that sovereignty matters when it came to Brexit, but when it comes to Scottish independence, it doesn't. It's the economy that matters.
That's completely the opposite of my point of view. People like me were highly critical of Better Together in 2014. It did make an economic case. The stuff that mattered at the end, people like Dan Snow and Tom Holland, popular historians, very well respected popular historians, made an emotional case out with the official UK Remain campaign, and it fed back into the Scottish debate in a way which flattered and engaged voters who weren't motivated at that point. So 100% the lesson of Brexit winning is you need to make an emotional and cultural case, not a dry economic case for why you want a country or a trading confederacy, which definitely isn't a country, to stay together.
Well, I've really enjoyed this discussion, and we could go on for some time. Thank you both very much indeed. It's been tremendous. Our next discussion is next Tuesday at 4 p.m. BST. That looks at the US election and the southern states. Are the Republican heartlands really about to vote Democratic? Perhaps the polls have got it all wrong again. My thanks very much again to Christopher Montgomery from The Critic, Stephen Castle from the New York Times. Thank you both very much indeed.